Today I'll be talking to you about the way in which we read a poem. Right. So when we talk about reading a poem, there are a few things that we have to bear in mind. I'm sure when we open the text or we see the monitor, the computer screen, we'll be struck primarily by the way in which the words are arranged on the page. And we will also recognize that it is very different from the way in which words are organized, let us say, for a short story or an essay or even a novel. Therefore, when we start reading a poem, there are a few things that we need to keep in mind. The first thing to keep in mind when we read a poem is that we must read a poem. When I say read a poem, what I mean is that we must read it loud. So when we read a poem, we must listen to what we are reading. Only if we listen to what we are reading will we know what we are reading. So when you then know what you are reading, you will know that this is a poem. Because if you don't know what you are reading, you will not know that this is a poem. The most important thing when you read a poem is that you must listen. You must listen with your eyes. Generally, we would say that we must listen with our ears. But then when you read a poem, you must listen with your eyes also. So what do I mean when I say that you must listen with your eyes? Remember that when you see a poem would have a very distinct structure. Some of these poems would have 3 lines put together and that would make up a stanza. Sometimes there would be 4 lines. Sometimes you would have only 2 lines. And you would have other kinds of poems where it may not have an organized stanza. Right? So we need to recognize that, number 1. And the other thing when we read a poem is that we must pay attention to punctuation marks. This is very, very important. Very often what happens is when we go to the class or you listen to the teacher or you try to read a poem on your own, we would begin always from one end, from the left margin, and we'll come to the end of it. We stop there and we'll start the second line, come to the end of it, stop there. If we read like this, we will never understand what the poem is trying to tell you. So there is a way in which we must keep in mind the punctuation marks. For example, what would the use of a comma denote when we read a poem? What would a semicolon denote when we read a poem? What would a hyphen denote when we read a poem? How do we read the spaces that are there between stanzas? How much pause should be given when there is a full stop? These are very important. Now that is one reason why I said that we must read, we must listen with our eyes if it is possible. Right? Now there are other things also to keep in mind when we read a poem. I said earlier that we should not be reading the poem starting from the left margin to the end of that line, stop and start again. Remember, in a poem, you would have the writer of that poem or the poet trying to communicate something. as minimum words as possible. It could be a thought, it could be a moral, it could be a vision, it could be a story, it could be ever so many things. And depending on that, the structure of the poem would emerge. So this is something that we have to bear in mind. Does the poet have an intention? So this is one other question that we would have. But more than that, does the poem that you read, does that have an intention? This is a very important question. So when we read a poem, we have to listen to the intention that the poem has. What intentions do you think a poem would have? We have to listen to the poem to understand what the poem intends. Alright? So, now think, for example, I will do one thing. I will take a random example and then tell you what would happen if we read a poem starting from one end to the other. We will not understand what the poem is trying to tell us. So this is going to be a very, very simple exercise. And what I will do is I will talk about a writer who is very, very familiar to all of us. The name of the poet is Robert Frost. Sure, Robert Frost is a familiar name to all of you. A poet who was writing in the United States of America. Very popular poet. He is a much anthologized poet, a favorite among students. So what I will do now is to very briefly read to you maybe two poems. I will give you an example of the way in which we can read a poem like Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Right? I will not talk about that in detail, but what I will do is I will read it the way in which a whole lot of people would read this poem. Right? Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. This is the title of the poem. I will read the poem in two or three different ways. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in a village door. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Now look what happens when you read a poem like this. What I have done is, I started, like I said earlier, from the margin, went to the end of it, stopped there, started, stopped. I did exactly like it because that is what we see. Right? So now imagine this, if I were to read this poem in a different way altogether. Right? Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village door. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, and I have promises to keep. Miles to go before I sleep. Miles to go. You will see that there was a very major, a really major difference in the way in which I read the poem the first time and the way in which I read it a second time. I am not going to explain what the poem is. Like I said, there is another way in which this poem can be read, and I'm sure this is the way in which a whole lot of young teachers and students have been taught this poem. Now, particularly when you come to the last part of the poem. Remember, earlier when in my second reading, the tone that I used was very subdued. But imagine what would happen when you read it like this. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. No harm in reading like this. But you can read it like this. But then what is it that you understand? What is it that you get when you read this poem like this? My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flick. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. You can read it. But look at this. I read it in 3 different ways. Do you get the same meaning in these 3 readings? This is a very, very important question to ask. If we think that the meaning, the poem already has a meaning, it is there in the poem, and you can, like children, when we are all little children, we go to a shop and we buy sweets. Remember those glass jars that the shopkeeper will have? Remember how you would hold your father's or mother's or grandfather's arm, go the point, look, I want that chocolate. And the shopkeeper will open the lid and he will tell you to put your hand in and you take the chocolate. So there is a container and there is a content. You put your hand in, you get the chocolate. A poem is not like that. You cannot put your hand in and say this is the meaning of the poem. If you want to understand a poem, it is your understanding. So the thing that you have to ask yourself is this: how can I understand the poem? You don't read a poem so that you try to, let's say, tell somebody else what the meaning of the poem is. More than the meaning of the poem, what is important is the understanding that you have. Now, I had 3 different ways of reading the poem, which will give me 3 different kind of understanding of the poem. The next question for me is this: which understanding is the better of all the 3? That will decide how you want to relate to the poem. What is it that this poem is trying to communicate to me? Each reading will communicate a different kind of a feeling to me. Right? And then, which one of the 3 is the better one? This is a question that I ask myself when I read a poem. Which kind of reading will give me the best of the poem? See, when a poet writes a poem, he or she will not tell you this is the way you must read it in as many words. What the poem would do is, it would have a lot of small things there to guide you, to tell you, look, read it like this, and this is what you will get. Don't read it like this, because if you read it like this, you will not get a lot more out of it. The third reading that I gave you was more like a military march, where the feel that you get is somebody who is marching across a forest. Now, imagine what would happen if you march across a forest or a thickly wooded area. Remember this, poems are very, very subtle. When we read it like that, we lose that subtlety. Poems are very sensitive. So if I am not alert to that sensitivity, I will not be able to make sense of the poem. In your class, generally, the teacher would have told you that this is a poem that inspired Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, this is a poem that inspired John F. Kennedy, the American president, etc. And one of them had etched the last 4 lines of this poem. Now, when in that second reading that I gave you, if you read the poem like that, you may not etch those 4 lines on your table. So, as I was saying, a poem is very sensitive. So when I read a poem, I must be open to that sensitivity. At the same time, some poems can be quite tricky to read. Now, remember this, when I read the earlier poem, Stopping by Woods, it was in a way a tricky poem. In the sense that it could open up those different ways of reading it. And you can be tricked into giving a reading that is far away from the sensitivity that the poem demands of you as a reader. Right? So what I will do now is, I will read another Robert Frost poem, a poem that is taught in a number of universities. This is a poem titled The Road Not Taken. Generally, when we teach the poem, we are told that this is a poem about the choices that we take in life. So how do we read this? Here again, we need to read with our eyes open. We have to listen to what we are reading. But very often what happens is that when you don't listen to what you are reading, and if you don't listen to what you are reading, you will not understand, you will not get an understanding of what the poem's sensitivity. At least if you are able to understand something, it is not the meaning, but the sensitivity in the poem. That's the only thing that you can understand. This is not normally the way in which we would talk about a poem. So now what I will do is, I will read The Road Not Taken. Right? Now what I will do is, I will first give you one reading and then let us see if a second reading is required. I will now again read it without paying attention to the punctuation marks. And then I will read it paying attention to the punctuation mark and the tone, etc. So the first reading here will be more or less like the first reading I did for the Stopping by the Woods poem. The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveller. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps a better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that the passing girl had worn them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay, in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere, ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. Okay. Now, what is it that we understand when we read this poem? Are we open to the sensitivities that the poem has? Now consider a reading that is slightly different. I'll pay attention to the punctuation mark. I'll try and capture the tone of the poem in the way in which I am reading it. Okay, so I'm going to read the poem once again. The road not taken. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry, I could not travel both and be one traveller. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth, then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted bare. Though as for that the passing there had warned them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden back. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet, knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. There can be many more ways of reading this poem. And what poems do is that it tells you a lot about the way in which it was composed. When we read a poem like this, we generally would ask this question to ourselves. What was the writer doing when he or she was composing this poem? This is a question that somehow will come into our mind. What kind of thoughts are this poem, or is this poem trying to tell you, communicate with you? Are you alert when you read to the kind of things that are hidden in the poem? Do poems hide things? Poems hide a lot of things. Poems reveal a lot of things. If you assume that poem gives you meaning, it will also hide things. When you give something, there are certain things that you will not give. And that's exactly what the poem, any poem for that matter, will do. A poem can always choose to give you whatever it chooses, whatever it wants to give you. It will not give you everything or everything that it has at one instant. You will have to read it again and again and again. That's the only way in which you will get to understand or even appreciate the sensitiveness that a poem has. Now, when we read this poem, when we study this poem, we generally are told that this is a poem that talks about the choices that we make in life. But then, read this poem again and you would understand that there are certain very fascinating things here. Things that make you think about the question of choice. When is it that we will talk about making a choice? We will talk about making a choice when we have options. And when we have options, it means that there are two or more than two things that are there having different qualities, and then at that point we feel that this is the best thing to do over this, this or this. It is like giving you three readings of one poem and asking you to choose which one gives you the better one. Right? Now, when you read a poem like The Road Not Taken, I said it's very important to pay attention to the punctuation marks. What I'll do now is, I'll try to see if I can read the poem like I did it earlier. Okay? My second reading. Will we be able to read a poem exactly the way in which we read it the previous time? Here also there is a matter of choice. The words are the same. What is a road? How does a road come into existence? How would a choice come into existence? How would a choice present itself to you? Ask this question. How would a choice present itself to you? How would a poem present itself to you? Right? Keep this question in mind and then let us read the poem once again. The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry, I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and water bare. Though as for that the passing bird had warned them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how wearily drawn to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages hence. Two roads diverged in wood, and I took the one less traveled. And that has made all the difference. Now I think this reading is slightly different from the way in which I read it the second time. What I want to tell you is this. The sensitivity that a poem has depends on the way in which things are packed into the poem. The way in which certain thoughts are packed into a poem. And every reading that you do would unravel those layers. Sometimes a poem would even have layers that it is not really aware of. And this becomes especially true when you read a poet like Robert Frost. Here is a writer who is a remarkable smuggler of thoughts. We understand this when we read it with the way in which, and we would recognize how Frost would very innocently use certain words. And then it all depends on how you learn to emphasize some of those words or slide over certain words. Now, if we are not able to do it, then we will be tricked by the poem. We will be tripped by the poem. Now, this is something that happens not just with Robert Frost. It would happen or happens with every poet worth his salt or her salt. Now, look for example, how we would read those two lines here, that word perhaps. In the third reading, there's a certain way in which I emphasize the word perhaps. Right? That would give the poem a certain kind of a feel, a texture. Or the two lines of the last two lines of the second stanza. Though as for that the passing there had warned them really about the same. So am I taking an untrodden path, or am I at that point telling myself that this is untrodden? See, when we read a poem, it is not that you get an absolute meaning or even a meaning. Every poem, for that matter, would play with immense possibilities. For example, when you read your Wordsworth and you come across a line like this, the child is father of the man. It can tell you a number of things. I'm just giving you one line from that poem. It can suggest a number of things. A lot depends on how you are going to read it. Poets always do it. And that is why you would say that it is a poem. When we read them, the poem, we must also learn to read a poem now with our ears as well. As in with our eyes, we read it, and then with our ears. I would say something here about poetry. Frost had written an essay on titled "The Figure a Poem Makes." Well, he has one little line. I will quote that line from memory. He says that the figure of the poem is like, or a poem, for example, is like the straight crookedness of a good walking stick. Now, how do you think we can read a line like this? The straight crookedness of a good walking stick. I'm sure all of us would have seen a walking stick, would have even tried to walk with the help of a walking stick. What would be the straight crookedness of a good walking stick? In our reading, we need to recognize the straightness of the crookedness of the walking stick. I hope you understand what I am trying to say. In other words, when you read a poem, you will learn how to read that poem. When you read another poem, you will learn how to read that poem. You read a third poem by another writer, you will learn, you understand how to read that poem. But then, if you read one poem and you tell yourself, look, I know how to read this poem, and with that understanding, if you go to read another poet's poem, you may not get it. Because that poem makes another demand on you. It makes another demand on you. Because that the sensitivity of that poem is different from, or will be different from the sensitivity of another poem written by another poet. Or it could be the same, the sensitivity could be different in two different poems written by the same poet. Because a poem is something that is very alive. It has breath, it has life. So when you read a poem, that is why I said you have to read it loud. When you read it loud, you breathe life into the poem. That is the only thing that you do when you read a poem. If you don't breathe life into the poem, it will no longer be a poem, it will be dead. The only thing that you do as a reader of a poem is to give life to what you are reading. This is all that I have to tell you now. Have a good time reading poetry.